The lottery ticket crumpled between my trembling fingers as I stared at the television screen, certain I was hallucinating. 7, 14, 20, 330, 142. Powerball 18. The same numbers I'd played religiously for 3 years. My birthday, my sister's birthday, and the date I'd left home forever. $100 million. The words echoed in my cramped studio apartment like a prayer I'd never dared to whisper. My name is Amelia Chen, and 24 hours ago, I was a nobody. A 38-year-old night shift nurse who ate ramen for dinner and wore secondhand scrubs because my paycheck barely covered rent in this godforsaken city. I was the daughter who hadn't spoken to her parents in 15 years, the sister who existed only in painful memories, the woman who'd convinced herself that love was a luxury she'd never afford. But now, staring at those 6 numbers that had just rewritten my entire existence, I couldn't stop thinking about the last words my mother, Eleanor Chen, had screamed at me the night I left. "You'll never amount to anything, you worthless piece of trash. Don't you dare come crawling back when you fail." My father, Robert Chen, had stood silent in the doorway, his eyes cold as winter stone, nodding his approval at her venom. They'd made their choice long before that night. My younger sister Sarah was their golden child, their investment in perfection, while I was the mistake they'd tried to correct for 23 years before finally giving up. The phone felt foreign in my hands as I dialed the lottery office. My voice cracked when I gave them my ticket numbers, and I almost laughed at the irony when the woman on the other end congratulated me with more warmth than my parents had ever shown. After taxes, I'd still have more money than 3 generations of my family had ever seen combined. I should have felt ecstatic. Instead, I felt hollow, like a ghost who'd suddenly been given flesh, but remembered only the pain of being invisible. The money couldn't fill the crater where my childhood should have been. Couldn't silence the echoes of every cruel word they'd carved into my soul. It couldn't bring back the little girl who'd once believed her parents loved her, before she learned that love was conditional, and she'd failed every test. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on my threadbare couch, clutching the ticket that had transformed me from trash into something else entirely, though I wasn't sure what. The apartment felt different now, smaller somehow, like I'd outgrown it in a matter of hours. Everything I'd known about my life, about my limitations, about my place in the world, had been obliterated by 6 random numbers. I thought about Sarah, wondered if she still lived in the shadow of our parents' impossible expectations, wondered if she ever thought about the sister who'd disappeared from her life like smoke. I thought about the empty chair at every family dinner I'd never been invited to, the holidays spent alone, the birthdays that passed unacknowledged. I thought about the college fund they'd never offered me, the support they'd never given, the basic human decency they'd withheld as if I hadn't earned it. But mostly, I thought about revenge. Not the petty kind, something deeper, more complex. I thought about power, about having something they needed, about being in a position to choose whether to help or turn away. For the first time in my adult life, I held cards they couldn't take from me. The irony wasn't lost on me that their worthless trash had just become worth more than they could comprehend. As dawn broke through my grimy windows, painting everything in shades of gold I'd never noticed before, I made a decision that would define everything that came next. I was going to disappear, at least for a while. Let the money settle, let the reality sink in, let myself figure out who Amelia Chen was when she wasn't defined by her parents' rejection. And then, when I was ready, I would decide what came next. The phone rang at 7 a.m. sharp, jolting me from my thoughts. "Amelia, honey, you were always such a difficult child." My mother's voice drifted through time as I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror of my new downtown hotel suite. 3 days had passed since the lottery win, and the memories were flooding back like water through a broken dam. I was 7 when I first understood I was different. Not different like having green eyes or being tall for my age. Different in a way that made my parents' faces tighten with disappointment every time they looked at me. Sarah, 2 years younger, had arrived like a gift from heaven, all golden curls and easy smiles. I arrived like a burden they hadn't signed up for. "Why can't you be more like your sister?" became the soundtrack of my childhood. Sarah made friends effortlessly while I struggled with social anxiety. Sarah excelled in school while I battled undiagnosed dyslexia that my parents dismissed as laziness. Sarah was invited to birthday parties while I spent weekends alone, wondering what invisible flaw marked me as unworthy of friendship. The family dinners were the worst. Every Sunday, Eleanor would set the table for 4, then remember at the last moment to add a 5th-place setting, with the reluctance of someone accommodating an unwelcome stranger. Robert would carve the roast while discussing Sarah's latest achievements, her soccer trophies, her perfect report cards, her acceptance into the gifted program. When they ran out of Sarah's accomplishments to celebrate, they'd turn to my shortcomings with the enthusiasm of archaeologists discovering fresh artifacts. "Amelia failed her math test again," Eleanor would announce, as if my struggles were a personal affront to her reputation. Mrs. Henderson says she's not applying herself. Aren't you embarrassed, Amelia? Don't you care about this family's reputation? I'd sit there, fork trembling in my small hands, wondering how a child could embarrass adults simply by existing imperfectly. The food would turn to cardboard in my mouth while Sarah received praise for finishing her vegetables, for sitting up straight, for breathing correctly, it seemed. Robert's silence was worse than Eleanor's words. He'd look at me like I was a problem he couldn't solve, a defective product he couldn't return. When other fathers coached Little League or taught their daughters to ride bikes, Robert taught Sarah while I watched from the window, my nose pressed against the glass like an outsider looking into someone else's life. The night I turned 16, they forgot my birthday entirely. I came downstairs expecting cake, maybe a small gift, at least acknowledgement that I'd survived another year in their house. Instead, I found them planning Sarah's 14th birthday party, an elaborate celebration scheduled for the following month. When I quietly mentioned my birthday, Eleanor looked genuinely surprised. "Oh, that's today. Well, we're rather busy with Sarah's party planning. Maybe next year we'll remember to get you something." That was the night I started planning my escape. Not the dramatic kind teenagers usually plot, but a careful, methodical plan to disappear from their lives as cleanly as possible. I got a part-time job, saved every penny, kept my grades just high enough to graduate without attracting attention, good or bad. The cruel irony was that my parents had created exactly what they accused me of being, a selfish, distant child who couldn't connect with them. They'd spent 18 years teaching me that love was earned through achievement, that family was a privilege I hadn't qualified for, that my very existence was a disappointment. Then they wondered why I couldn't give them the warmth and affection they'd never shown me. Sarah tried sometimes. I'd catch her looking at me with confusion, as if she couldn't understand why our parents treated their daughters so differently. But she was smart enough, even at 14, to know which side of the family divide offered safety. She learned to love me quietly, in stolen moments when our parents weren't watching, and to ignore me publicly when survival demanded it. The morning I left for college, on a partial scholarship I'd earned through relentless studying and 3 jobs, they barely looked up from their breakfast. Eleanor made some comment about finally having peace and quiet, while Robert grunted his approval. Sarah hugged me goodbye with tears in her eyes, and I realized she was the only member of my family who would miss me. I never came back. Not for Christmas, not for spring break, not for Sarah's graduation. I built a new life from nothing, worked my way through nursing school, learned to find family among colleagues and friends. I taught myself that love didn't have to be earned, that kindness wasn't a limited resource, that I had value beyond my ability to meet impossible expectations. But the scars remained, invisible but permanent, shaping every relationship I attempted, every risk I avoided, every dream I didn't dare voice. Even now, holding a lottery ticket worth more than their house, their cars, their entire carefully constructed middle-class existence, I could still hear Eleanor's voice calling me worthless trash. The hotel phone rang, interrupting my memories. "You have 17 missed calls," my phone announced as I powered it on for the first time in 4 days. I'd been living in a bubble of luxury hotels and quiet anonymity, trying to process the magnitude of my new reality. The missed calls were all from unknown numbers, reporters probably, or distant relatives who'd somehow connected the dots between the lottery winner named Amelia Chen and the family disappointment they'd written off decades ago. I deleted them all without listening. Nursing had saved me. Not just financially, though the steady paycheck had meant independence from my parents' conditional love, but emotionally. Every shift at Philadelphia General Hospital reminded me that I had value, that my hands could heal, that my presence could comfort someone in their darkest hour. Mrs. Rodriguez in room 302 didn't care that I'd been called trash by my own mother. 7-year-old Marcus in pediatrics lit up when I walked into his room, and his joy had nothing to do with my family's approval. I'd built my chosen family among the night shift workers. There was Janet, the veteran nurse who'd taken me under her wing during my first terrifying weeks, teaching me that competence mattered more than pedigree. Miguel, the orderly who brought homemade tamales every Christmas, because he knew I spent holidays alone. Dr. Sarah Kim, not my sister, but a woman who shared the name and possessed all the warmth my biological sister had never been allowed to show me. "You know what your problem is, Amy?" Janet had said during one of our 3 a.m. coffee breaks, using the nickname only she was allowed to use. "You think you're not worth fighting for because nobody taught you how to fight for yourself, but I see you with these patients. You fight like hell for them." She was right. I'd spent 15 years learning to pour into others what had been denied to me: unconditional care, patience with imperfection, love that didn't fluctuate based on performance. My patients' families thanked me with tears in their eyes, brought me flowers and cards, treated me like I mattered. It was healing, in its way. though it couldn't fill the specific void shaped like parental love. My apartment, the cramped studio I'd just abandoned for hotel suites, had been carefully curated to prove I was nothing like them. Where their house was all matching furniture and status symbols, mine was filled with rescued plants, secondhand books, and photographs of my chosen family. Where they valued appearance over substance, I valued authenticity over everything. I'd had relationships, though none that lasted. The problem wasn't finding people who could love me. It was believing I deserved to be loved. Every partner eventually grew frustrated with my inability to accept their affection without questioning their motives. "Why are you with me?" I'd ask, genuinely confused by their choice. "What do you see in me?" The questions that should have been answered in childhood remained open wounds in my adult relationships. David had been the closest I'd come to real love, a fellow nurse, kind and patient, who'd spent 2 years trying to convince me that I was worthy of the love I gave so freely to others. "Your parents were wrong about you," he'd whisper in the dark of my bedroom. "You're not broken. You're not too much or not enough. You're exactly who you're supposed to be." But even David couldn't compete with the voices in my head. Eleanor's criticisms, Robert's indifference, the 23 years of evidence that I was fundamentally flawed. When he proposed, I panicked. Marriage meant family, and family meant the possibility of recreating the dynamic that had nearly destroyed me. I gave back the ring with tears in my eyes and apologies on my lips, knowing I was throwing away the best thing that had ever happened to me, but unable to risk the alternative. He married someone else 6 months later. I smiled at their wedding and meant it. David deserved happiness, even if I couldn't provide it, especially because I couldn't provide it. Work became my refuge, my identity, my proof of worth. 12-hour shifts, overtime when available, holidays volunteered for because I had nowhere else to be. My colleagues called me dedicated. I knew I was hiding. It was easier to lose myself in other people's crises than to face the silence of my own life. The irony of wealth was that it stripped away all my carefully constructed defenses. Money couldn't earn my parents' love. I'd learned that lesson watching them pour everything into Sarah while treating me like an afterthought. Money couldn't buy back the childhood I'd lost or the relationships I'd sabotaged. It couldn't even buy me peace, because peace required addressing the wounds I'd spent 15 years avoiding. But money could buy something else: choice. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't have to work to survive. I could choose what came next, choose how to respond if my parents ever came calling, choose whether to break the cycle of rejection and indifference that had defined my family for 2 generations. Sitting in my hotel suite, watching the city lights twinkle like stars I could actually reach, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: possibility. Not happiness, not yet, but the foundation on which happiness might be built. The possibility terrified me. 3 weeks into my new life as a lottery winner, I was beginning to believe I might escape my past entirely. I'd hired a financial advisor, a lawyer, and a publicist who specialized in keeping winners' identities private. I'd donated $1 million anonymously to Philadelphia General's pediatric ward and felt more satisfaction than I'd experienced in years. The suite at the Ritz-Carlton had become my temporary sanctuary while I figured out what came next. Then my phone rang at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, jolting me from the first peaceful sleep I'd had since winning. "Hello?" My voice was thick with sleep and confusion. The number was blocked, but something about the late hour made me answer despite my usual caution. "Amelia?" The voice was older, rougher around the edges, but unmistakably my father's. Robert Chen, the man who'd watched his wife call me trash without ever once defending his eldest daughter, was on my phone after 15 years of silence. My blood turned to ice water. "How did you get this number?" We hired someone, a private investigator." His voice cracked slightly, and I realized with shock that Robert Chen was crying. My father, who'd never shown emotion beyond disappointment and irritation, was crying on my phone at midnight. "Amelia, we need to talk." "No." The word came out sharp and clean, a blade cutting through 15 years of buried pain. "We don't need to talk. We never needed to talk. Please, just listen." There was desperation in his voice now, raw and unfamiliar. "Your mother, Eleanor, is sick. Really sick. Cancer, stage 4. The treatments— oh God, Amelia, the treatments are bankrupting us. We've lost the house, the cars, everything. The medical bills are over $800,000. And insurance won't cover the experimental treatments she needs." I sat up in the hotel bed, my heart hammering against my ribs. Cancer. Eleanor Chen, the woman who'd spent my childhood dissecting my failures with surgical precision, was dying. The irony was so sharp, it cut. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and I was surprised to find I meant it. Whatever Eleanor had done to me, cancer was an enemy too cruel for anyone. "But I don't understand why you're calling me." The silence stretched between us like a chasm. When Robert spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. "We know about the lottery, Amelia. We know you won." My blood pressure spiked. "How?" "The investigator, when we were looking for you, trying to find any family member who might help us, he found the connection. Amelia Chen, age 38, former resident of Meadowbrook, Pennsylvania. Your birthday matches the lottery numbers. We put it together." Of course they had. My parents were many things, but stupid wasn't one of them. They'd raised one daughter to be perfect and spent 23 years cataloging the other's flaws. They knew my birthday, knew my history, knew exactly who I was, even if they'd never understood what I needed. "So you called to ask for money." It wasn't a question. I'd known from the moment I heard Robert's voice that this was where the conversation was heading. The prodigal parents, crawling back to the daughter they'd discarded, hands outstretched and pride finally broken. "We're dying, Amelia." His voice was hollow now, defeated. "Not just Eleanor, me too. Watching her fade away, watching everything we built disappear. I'm dying inside. We have no one else. Sarah has her own family now, her own problems. She can't carry this burden. But you have money now. More money than God. I know we don't deserve your help. I know we weren't good parents to you." The understatement was so massive it was almost funny. Weren't good parents. Like they'd occasionally forgotten to pack my lunch instead of systematically destroying my self-worth for 2 decades. "You called me trash," I said quietly. "The last words my mother spoke to me were that I was worthless trash who would never amount to anything." "I know." His voice broke completely. "I know. And I hate myself for it. For all of it. For not protecting you. For not stopping her. For letting you leave thinking we didn't love you. But Amelia, please. Eleanor has maybe 6 months if we can afford the treatments. Maybe a year if we get the good stuff. I can't watch her die knowing I didn't try everything." Love. He'd said the word love. In 15 years of silence, Robert Chen had called me once, and he'd used the word love. The child in me, the little girl who'd pressed her face against the window while he taught Sarah to ride a bike, that child wanted to believe him, wanted to think that somewhere beneath the indifference and neglect, there had been love. The adult in me knew better. This wasn't about love, it was about desperation. They'd spent my inheritance on their golden daughter, poured their resources into the child who'd met their expectations, and now they wanted the one they'd thrown away to save them from the consequences. "I need to think," I said finally. "There isn't time for thinking," Robert pleaded. "The next treatment cycle starts Monday. If we can't pay, they'll drop her from the program. $800,000, Amelia. It's nothing to you now, but it's everything to us. $800,000. 2 months ago, it would have been an impossible sum. Now it was what I'd spent on hotel rooms and lawyers without thinking twice. The money wasn't the issue. The principle was everything. "I'll call you back," I said, and hung up before he could respond. Then I sat in the dark of my suite, shaking, while 15 years of carefully constructed walls crumbled around me. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Instead, I sat by the window watching Philadelphia wake up, wrestling with a decision that felt like it would define not just my future, but who I was at my core. The city lights blurred through tears I didn't remember shedding, and I found myself thinking about justice, mercy, and the terrible space between them. $800,000. In my new reality, it was pocket change. I'd already committed to donating millions to charity, had established a foundation, bought my first house, a modest 3-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood where no one would know my story. The money to save Eleanor's life was already sitting in accounts I barely monitored, earning interest while my mother apparently counted down her remaining days. But this wasn't about money. This was about 23 years of systematic emotional destruction, about being told I was worthless so many times I'd believed it, about watching my sister get the love I'd desperately craved while I got criticism and indifference. This was about the night I'd come downstairs at 16, hoping someone had remembered my birthday, and finding them planning Sarah's party instead. I called in sick to the hospital for the first time in 3 years. The lie tasted bitter in my mouth. I'd built my adult identity on reliability, on being the person who showed up even when it was hard. But I couldn't face my patients while carrying this emotional bomb, couldn't pretend to care about anyone else's problems, when my own past was exploding across my present. Janet texted me twice, worried. Miguel called to check on me. Dr. Kim sent a message asking if I needed anything. My chosen family, reaching out with the care my biological family had never shown. And I couldn't even explain what was wrong without revealing the truth about the lottery win. By noon, I'd walked 15 miles through the city, trying to exhaust the anxiety that was eating me alive. I found myself in Rittenhouse Square, sitting on a bench where families were playing with their children, and I watched a father teach his toddler to throw a ball. Every time the little boy missed, the father cheered anyway. "Good try, buddy. Let's try again. Good try, buddy." When had anyone ever said those words to me? When had anyone celebrated my efforts instead of critiquing my failures? My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Amy, it's Sarah. Dad gave me your number. I know this is awkward, but can we talk? Please, Sarah, my sister, who'd grown up in the same house but lived in a completely different family. Sarah, who'd inherited our parents' love and approval like a birthright while I'd fought for scraps. Sarah, who was probably calling now to add her voice to their plea for money. I stared at the message for 10 minutes before responding. I'm not ready. Her reply came immediately. I understand, but Amy, they're different now. Mom, especially. The cancer changed her. She talks about you all the time, about how sorry she is. I think she's been sorry for years but didn't know how to fix it. Sorry. 23 years too late, but sorry. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. Eleanor Chen, the woman who'd perfected the art of cutting me down with surgical precision, was sorry now that she needed something from me. How convenient that terminal illness had finally taught her remorse. But another part of me, the part that had never stopped being that little girl desperate for her mother's love, wanted to believe it. Wanted to think that somewhere beneath the cruelty and indifference, there had always been a woman who loved her daughter and just didn't know how to show it. I walked home to my old apartment, needing to see the life I'd built before the lottery had complicated everything. The building looked smaller than I remembered, shabbier. Mrs. Patterson from 3B was checking her mail and waved when she saw me. Haven't seen you around, dear. Everything all right? Just busy with work, I lied, because the truth was too complicated for a hallway conversation. Mrs. Patterson had been kinder to me in 5 years of casual encounters than my parents had been in my entire childhood. My apartment felt like a museum of who I used to be. The carefully curated books, the rescued plants, the photographs of my chosen family. On the refrigerator, held up by a magnet shaped like a stethoscope, was a card from 8-year-old Marcus in pediatrics. Thank you for making me feel better when I was scared. You are the best nurse in the world. You are the best nurse in the world. Written in crayon by a child who barely knew me. And it meant more than 23 years of my parents' criticism. That's when I realized what I was going to do. Not because they deserved it, not because I'd forgiven them or because I believed their newfound remorse was genuine, but because the little girl who'd been called trash had grown into a woman who saved lives, who showed up for people in their darkest hours, who chose kindness even when it wasn't returned. I was going to help them, but on my terms. They would never know it was me. They would receive their salvation as an anonymous gift, a miracle that had nothing to do with their discarded daughter. They would get to live, but they wouldn't get the satisfaction of my forgiveness or the comfort of my presence. They would get mercy without redemption, charity without reconciliation. I picked up my phone and called my lawyer. I need to make an anonymous donation to cover someone's medical expenses. $800,000, maybe a little more for good measure. Can you make it completely untraceable? Of course. What's the recipient information? As I gave him my parents' details, I felt something settle in my chest. Not peace, exactly, but a kind of resigned justice. I was choosing to be better than they'd been, to break the cycle of cruelty they'd started, but I wasn't choosing to let them back into my life. The wire transfer went through on a Thursday morning. $1 million, enough to cover Eleanor's treatments with plenty left over for the ancillary costs that always accompanied serious illness. My lawyer had structured it through a charitable foundation that specialized in anonymous medical donations, complete with a cover story about a philanthropist who preferred to remain unnamed. The hospital would receive the funds directly, with instructions that the Chen family's debt was to be forgiven entirely. I imagined my father's face when he received the call. Robert Chen, who'd spent his career as a mid-level insurance adjuster, a man who understood the brutal mathematics of medical bills and coverage limits, would know exactly what this meant. It would feel like a miracle, divine intervention for people who'd probably prayed more in the last 6 months than in their entire previous lives combined. The thought gave me a bitter satisfaction that I wasn't proud of. I returned to work the next day, throwing myself into the familiar rhythms of the night shift with desperate intensity. Room 314 had a new patient, Mrs. Ellis, 73, admitted with complications from diabetes. Her daughter sat beside the bed, holding her mother's hand with the fierce tenderness I'd always envied in other families. She raised 5 kids by herself after Dad died, the daughter told me as I checked vitals. Worked 3 jobs, never missed one of our soccer games or recitals. I can't imagine a world without her. I nodded, made appropriate sounds of sympathy, and tried not to think about Eleanor Chen lying in some other hospital bed, finally receiving the care her daughter's lottery winnings had purchased. Did my mother have anyone sitting beside her bed with that same fierce tenderness? Was Sarah there, or was Eleanor facing her illness with the same isolation she'd imposed on me? The thought shouldn't have bothered me. I'd made my choice, mercy without reconciliation, charity without forgiveness. But standing in that hospital room, watching a daughter love her mother with uncomplicated devotion, I felt the familiar ache of something I'd never had and never would. 3 days passed before my phone rang again. Amelia? Robert's voice was different this time. Lighter, filled with something I'd never heard from him before. Joy, maybe, or hope. Something incredible happened. A miracle, really. I said nothing, just held the phone and listened to my father experience the salvation I'd purchased for him. Someone paid Eleanor's bills, all of them, the whole amount, plus extra for medications and follow-up care. Anonymous donor through some charity foundation. The hospital called yesterday. They said Eleanor's been selected as the recipient of a major gift, that someone wanted to help families facing catastrophic medical expenses. His voice broke, and I realized he was crying again. 2 conversations in 15 years, and Robert Chen had cried during both of them. The father who'd never shown emotion beyond mild irritation was falling apart on my phone, undone by kindness from a stranger who wasn't a stranger at all. That's wonderful news, I managed. How is Eleanor handling the treatments? She's responding well. The doctors are optimistic. But Amelia, his voice grew heavy. She keeps asking about you. Every day she asks if I've called you, if you've called back. She wants to see you before, well, while she still can. The guilt is eating her alive. She knows what we did to you was wrong. Guilt. 23 years too late. But finally, guilt. I wondered if Eleanor Chen's guilt felt anything like mine. Sharp and constant, a weight that pressed against your chest until breathing became difficult. I wondered if she lay awake at night, replaying our interactions, searching for moments when she could have chosen kindness instead of criticism. Probably not. Guilt was a luxury for people who'd learned empathy before they learned cruelty. I'm glad she's doing better, I said carefully, but I'm not ready to see her. I may never be ready. I understand. Robert's voice was quiet. I know we don't have the right to ask anything of you, but this anonymous donor, it's made me think about grace, about undeserved gifts. Someone we'll never meet chose to save Eleanor's life for no reason except compassion. It's made me realize that maybe forgiveness isn't something we earn. Maybe it's something we receive despite not deserving it. The irony was so sharp it cut. My father was learning about grace through the very grace I'd shown him, was discovering the meaning of undeserved love through the love I'd given despite everything he'd done to forfeit it. He was having a spiritual awakening funded by the daughter he'd taught to believe she was worthless trash. Grace is complicated, I said finally. Sometimes the person who needs to forgive isn't ready. Sometimes forgiveness is something you do for yourself, not for the person who hurt you. And sometimes mercy is the best you can do. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of 15 years hanging between us like a bridge neither of us was ready to cross. I should go, I said finally. I'm glad Eleanor is getting the care she needs. I hope she recovers fully. Amelia, wait, Robert's voice was urgent. This donor, this miracle, it's changed us. Eleanor especially. She's a different person, softer. She talks about all the things she wishes she'd done differently, all the words she wishes she could take back. If you could see her now, but I couldn't see her now. I couldn't risk the carefully constructed walls I'd built. Couldn't chance that my mother's deathbed conversion was real instead of just another manipulation. I'd shown them mercy, but mercy didn't require me to offer myself up for further destruction. Give her my best, I said, and hung up before he could respond. That night, I sat in my apartment and cried for the mother I'd never had and the family I'd never be part of, even though I'd just saved their lives. 2 weeks later, they showed up at my door. I was making coffee on a Saturday morning, still in my pajamas, when the knock came, soft at first, then more insistent. I looked through the peephole and froze. Robert and Sarah stood in the hallway, both looking older than I remembered, both shifting nervously like supplicants at a temple door. My first instinct was to pretend I wasn't home, to let them stand there until they gave up and left. But Sarah looked directly at the peephole, as if she knew I was watching, and mouthed a single word, please. I opened the door with the security chain still attached, creating a gap just wide enough for conversation. How did you find me? The same investigator, Robert said quietly. I know this is intrusive, Amelia. I know we don't have the right to show up unannounced, but we needed to see you. Sarah looked terrible, thin and hollow-eyed, like someone who hadn't slept in weeks. The golden child of our childhood had faded into a tired woman wearing worry like a second skin. Amy, can we come in? Just for a few minutes? Against my better judgment, I unhooked the chain and stepped aside. They entered my apartment like they were walking into a church, taking in the carefully curated space I'd built to prove I was nothing like them. Robert's eyes lingered on the photographs of my chosen family, while Sarah picked up one of my nursing textbooks with something that looked like pride. You did it, Sarah said softly. You built a good life. I'm so proud of you. The words hit me like a physical blow. Proud. When was the last time anyone in my biological family had said they were proud of me? Had anyone ever said it? What do you want? I asked, because pleasantries felt impossible when I was still in my pajamas and they were standing in my living room after 15 years of silence. Robert cleared his throat. We came to talk about the donor, the person who saved Eleanor's life. My blood turned to ice. Had they figured it out? Was this some elaborate confrontation? An attempt to guilt me into revealing myself so they could add gratitude to their list of emotional weapons? What about them? I tried to keep my voice neutral. We want to find them, Sarah said, settling onto my couch without invitation. We've been working with the hospital, the foundation, anyone who might have records. Mom wants to thank them personally. She's obsessed with it, actually. She says she can't die in peace knowing someone that generous exists in the world without her expressing proper gratitude. Robert nodded, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture I remembered from childhood, the stance he took when delivering bad news or difficult truths. The money came at exactly the right moment, the day before Eleanor was going to be dropped from the treatment program. It was like someone knew precisely how desperate we were, precisely what we needed. And they had no idea. For all their investigation and speculation, they hadn't connected their discarded daughter to their mysterious benefactor. I felt a mixture of relief and something else. Disappointment, maybe, that they still couldn't see me clearly even when I was standing right in front of them. That's very generous of whoever it was, I said carefully. I'm sure they don't need thanks. People who donate anonymously usually prefer to stay that way. But that's just it, Sarah insisted, leaning forward with an intensity that reminded me uncomfortably of Eleanor in her prime. Mom has theories. She thinks it might be someone who knew us, someone who'd heard about her illness. She's been going through old phone books, reaching out to everyone we've ever known, convinced that if she can just find this person, she can somehow make amends for things. 23 years of emotional abuse reduced to things, as if my childhood had been a minor misunderstanding rather than systematic destruction. What kind of things? I asked, though I knew I was stepping into dangerous territory. Robert and Sarah exchanged a look, one of those loaded family communications that happened in silence. Finally, Robert spoke, his voice heavy with something that might have been regret. We weren't good parents to you, Amelia. We know that now. Eleanor especially. She was dealing with her own demons, her own childhood traumas, and she took them out on you in ways that were inexcusable. The guilt has been consuming her since you left. She says that finding this donor, thanking them properly, is practice for what she wants to say to you. Practice. My mother's deathbed apology was a rehearsal for the real performance she wanted to give me. Even her remorse was calculated, strategic, designed to achieve maximum impact. I see. The words came out sharper than I'd intended. So, this mysterious donor is what? A trial run for earning forgiveness from the daughter you called trash? The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's face went white, while Robert looked like I'd slapped him. Neither of them had expected me to be quite so direct, quite so willing to name the specific cruelties they'd hoped to gloss over as things. You remember that, Sarah whispered. After all these years, you remember the exact words. I remember everything, I said, and I meant it. Every birthday they'd forgotten, every accomplishment they'd dismissed, every cruel word they'd used to carve away pieces of my self-worth. The lottery win might have changed my bank account, but it hadn't given me amnesia. Robert cleared his throat again. Eleanor doesn't remember saying that. The medications, the treatments, they've affected her memory. She remembers the emotions, the regret, but not the specific incidents. Now we'd gone from things to incidents, as if systematic emotional abuse was a series of unfortunate accidents rather than deliberate choices made by adults who should have protected their child instead of destroying her. How convenient, I said. She gets to feel guilty about hurting me without having to face the specific ways she did it. That's not fair, Sarah said, and there was heat in her voice now. Mom is dying, Amy. She's genuinely sorry for whatever happened between you two. Can't you find it in your heart to show a little compassion? Whatever happened between you two. As if it had been a mutual conflict, instead of a grown woman systematically tearing down a child's sense of self-worth, as if I bore equal responsibility for the dynamic that had driven me from their lives. I showed compassion, I said quietly, more than you know. Something in my tone must have caught their attention, because they both looked at me sharply. Robert tilted his head, studying my face with the same analytical expression he'd worn when reviewing insurance claims. What do you mean? He asked slowly. This was the moment. The crossroads where I could continue the charade or reveal the truth that would shatter their comfortable narrative about mysterious benefactors and divine intervention. They wanted to find their anonymous donor to practice gratitude before approaching me, never suspecting that their donor and their discarded daughter were the same person. I looked at Sarah, at the sister who'd inherited the love I'd craved, who'd grown up in the same house but lived in an entirely different family. I looked at Robert, the father who'd watched his wife destroy his eldest daughter and done nothing to stop it. They'd come here looking for help finding their savior, never imagining they were sitting in her living room. I mean that sometimes the people who hurt us the most are also the ones who save us, I said finally, and sometimes we're too blind to see the difference. Robert's eyes narrowed slightly, and I could see him working through possibilities, connecting dots he'd never thought to connect. Sarah just looked confused, but then Sarah had always been slower to read the emotional undercurrents that had defined our family. "Amelia," Robert said very carefully, "is there something you want to tell us?" The question hung in the air between us like a sword about to fall. I stood there for a long moment, watching my father's face as understanding began to dawn. Robert Chen was many things, but stupid wasn't one of them. He was connecting the timeline. Their desperate phone call, my evasive responses, the anonymous donation that had appeared exactly when they needed it most. I could see the precise moment when the pieces clicked into place. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, sinking into my armchair like his legs had given out. "It was you." Sarah looked between us, confusion written across her features. "What was her? What are you talking about, Dad?" "The donor," Robert said, his voice hollow with shock. "The anonymous donor who paid your mother's medical bills. It was Amelia." The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, the distant sound of traffic from the street below, the thundering of my own heartbeat. Sarah's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, realization, shock, something that might have been awe. "You?" Sarah breathed. "You saved Mom's life?" "I paid some medical bills," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Nothing more dramatic than that. Nothing more dramatic." Robert stood up abruptly, beginning to pace my small living room like a caged animal. "Amelia, you spent $1 million on people who treated you like garbage. You saved the life of a woman who called you worthless trash. That's not just dramatic, it's incomprehensible." There it was. The word I'd been waiting 15 years to hear him acknowledge. Trash. He'd finally admitted what Eleanor had called me, had finally put words to the cruelty he'd witnessed and allowed. Why? Sarah's voice was small, almost childlike. "After everything we did to you, why would you help her?" I looked at my sister, really looked at her for the first time since they'd arrived. The golden curls had darkened to brown, and there were lines around her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and adult worries. She wasn't the perfect child of my memories anymore. She was a woman who'd lived long enough to understand that families could be complicated, that love could coexist with damage. "Because I'm a nurse," I said finally. "I save lives. It's what I do, even when the person doesn't deserve it." "Don't deserve it." Robert stopped pacing and stared at me. "Amelia, your mother loves you. She's always loved you. She didn't know how to show it." The laugh that escaped me was harsh and bitter. "She didn't know how to show love. She showed Sarah love just fine. She knew how to praise Sarah, how to encourage Sarah, how to celebrate Sarah's achievements and comfort her failures. She just chose not to do those things for me." "It wasn't about choice," Robert said desperately. "Eleanor's own childhood was difficult. Her parents were cruel to her, and she swore she'd never repeat those patterns. But sometimes trauma finds a way to perpetuate itself. She saw something in you that reminded her of herself, and it triggered all her old wounds. So she decided to create new wounds in me." I shook my head. "Dad, I spent 23 years thinking I was fundamentally flawed, that something about me made me unlovable. Do you understand what that does to a person? Do you have any idea how it feels to be the one child in a family who doesn't get unconditional love?" Sarah was crying now, tears streaming down her face as she stared at her hands. "I knew," she whispered. "I was just a kid, but I knew you were treated differently. I knew it wasn't fair, but I was so afraid. I was afraid if I stood up for you, they'd turn on me too. I was selfish and cowardly, and I'm so sorry." Her words hit me like a physical blow. All these years, I'd convinced myself that Sarah hadn't noticed, that she'd been too young to understand the dynamics that had shaped our childhood. But she'd known. She'd seen her sister being destroyed, and chosen her own safety over defending me. "You were a child," I said, though the words felt inadequate. "It wasn't your job to protect me. It was my job as your sister," Sarah said fiercely. "It was my job as a human being, and I failed you just as much as they did." Robert had gone very still, his face pale as he processed what we were revealing. "You saved her life," he said again, as if the reality was too large for his mind to encompass. "After everything we put you through, you still saved her life." "I didn't do it for you," I said bluntly. "I didn't do it for Eleanor either. I did it because 8-year-old Amelia, the little girl you all taught to hate herself, she deserved better parents than she got. I couldn't give her that, but I could make sure she didn't have to live with the guilt of letting you die when she had the power to save you." "The lottery numbers," Robert said suddenly. "Your birthday, Sarah's birthday. You've been playing our family's dates. For 3 years, I confirmed. Every week the same numbers. Maybe I was hoping for this exact scenario, having enough money to help you, and enough power to do it on my terms." Sarah looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "What are your terms, Amy? What do you want from us?" It was the question I'd been asking myself since the moment I'd decided to pay their bills. What did I want? Revenge felt hollow now that I had it. They'd come to my door looking for their mysterious savior, never suspecting they were face to face with the daughter they'd discarded. The irony should have felt satisfying, but instead, it just felt sad. "I want you to leave," I said quietly. "I want you to go home to Eleanor and tell her that her anonymous donor was the daughter she called worthless trash. I want her to live with the knowledge that the person she tried so hard to destroy was the one who saved her life. And then I want all of you to leave me alone." "Amelia, please," Robert started, but I held up my hand. "I'm not done. I want you to understand that mercy and forgiveness aren't the same thing. I showed you mercy because I'm not the person you raised me to believe I was. I'm not worthless. I'm not trash. And I'm not incapable of love. But mercy doesn't mean I have to let you back into my life. It doesn't mean I have to pretend the past didn't happen, or that we can suddenly be a happy family." The room was quiet, except for Sarah's soft crying. Robert looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past hour. "Can I ask you one thing?" he said finally. I nodded. Is there any possibility that someday, maybe years from now, we could try to build something new? Not pretending the past didn't happen, but acknowledging it and trying to do better? I looked at this man, who had been my father for 23 years, and a stranger for 15. I thought about the little girl who'd pressed her face against the window, watching him teach Sarah to ride a bike. I thought about second chances and whether people could really change, about forgiveness, and whether it was something you earned or something you received as grace. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I really don't know." But as I watched them prepare to leave, I realized that "I don't know" was closer to hope than I'd been in 15 years. They left quietly, but their presence lingered in my apartment like smoke. I stood at the window, watching them walk down the street, Robert's shoulders hunched with the weight of revelation, Sarah turning back once to look up at my building. They moved like people who'd just been in an accident, struggling to process what had happened to them. I should have felt vindicated. For 15 years I'd fantasized about this moment, the day my parents would finally understand the magnitude of what they'd lost when they chose to discard me. I'd imagined their shock, their remorse, their desperate attempts to win back the daughter they'd never appreciated. The reality should have been satisfying. Instead, I felt hollow. My phone rang before they'd even reached the end of the block. I almost didn't answer, but the caller ID showed Janet's name, and Janet never called unless it was important. "Amy?" Her voice was sharp with concern. "I need you to come in. Emergency. We're short-staffed, and there's been a multi-car accident. Trauma bays are overflowing. I'll be there in 20 minutes, I said, grateful for the distraction. I needed to be useful, needed to remember who I was when I wasn't defined by my parents' failures. The hospital was chaos when I arrived. Paramedics wheeling in stretcher after stretcher, doctors shouting orders, the controlled pandemonium of people fighting to save lives. I threw myself into the work with desperate intensity, starting IVs, monitoring vitals, providing the steady presence that trauma patients needed when their world had suddenly become uncertain. Room 3 had a teenage girl, maybe 16, who'd been thrown from a car when her boyfriend lost control on a wet road. Her parents arrived as I was checking her neurological responses, and I watched them transform from terrified adults back into fierce protectors of their child. "Is she going to be okay?" her mother asked, gripping her daughter's hand like she could transfer her own life force through touch. "The doctors are very optimistic," I said gently. "She's strong and she's fighting. That's a good sign." "She's everything to us," her father said, and his voice broke. "I can't imagine. We can't lose her. She's our whole world." I nodded and made the appropriate sounds, but inside I was thinking about how love was supposed to work. These parents, faced with their child's mortality, saw only her preciousness. My parents, faced with my very existence, had seen only disappointment. The shift stretched into overtime, then double overtime. By the time the last patient was stabilized and the emergency had passed, it was nearly dawn. I sat in the break room with a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago, staring at my reflection in the vending machine glass. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, but I recognized Sarah's writing style. "Amy, Mom wants to see you. She knows it was you. Please consider it. She's not the same person who hurt you." I stared at the message for a long time, my finger hovering over the delete button. Eleanor Chen, the woman who'd spent my childhood dissecting my failures with surgical precision, wanted to see me now that she knew I'd saved her life. Did she want to offer apologies? Or was this just another attempt to manipulate the daughter she'd never understood? Before I could talk myself out of it, I found myself driving toward my parents' old neighborhood. I hadn't been back to Meadowbrook in 15 years, and the familiar streets felt like visiting a crime scene. The house looked smaller than I remembered, shabbier. The garden Eleanor had once maintained with obsessive precision was overgrown, the lawn patchy and neglected. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, engine running, ready to flee at the first sign of what? What was I afraid of? That Eleanor would hurt me again? That she'd somehow reduce me back to that desperate child who'd craved her approval? That I'd discover the woman who'd saved lives and built a meaningful existence was still, at her core, the worthless daughter her mother had told her she was? Finally, I turned off the engine and walked to the front door. Robert answered my knock, his eyes widening with surprise and something that looked like relief. "Amelia, I didn't think. Thank you for coming. Is she awake?" "She's been awake for hours, waiting. She hasn't slept since we told her." He gestured toward the living room. She's very frail, Amelia. The treatments have been hard on her, but her mind is clear." I followed him into the room where I'd spent so many uncomfortable Sunday dinners, where I'd sat silent while they celebrated Sarah's achievements and catalogued my failures. Eleanor was propped up on the couch, wearing a silk scarf to cover her baldness, and when she saw me, she began to cry. "My baby," she whispered, and the endearment hit me like a physical blow. When had Eleanor Chen ever called me her baby? When had she ever looked at me with anything approaching maternal tenderness? "Hello, Eleanor." I couldn't bring myself to say Mom. That word belonged to the woman who'd never existed, the mother I'd dreamed of having instead of the one I'd actually gotten. "You saved my life," she said, her voice barely audible. "My daughter, who I treated so terribly, saved my life." "I paid some medical bills," I said, the same deflection I'd used with Robert and Sarah. "Nothing more. Don't minimize it." Eleanor struggled to sit up straighter, and I could see the effort it cost her. "You had every right to let me die. You had every reason to hate me enough to wish me dead. Instead, you spent a fortune to keep me alive. Why?" It was the same question Sarah had asked, the same question I'd been asking myself. Why had I saved the woman who'd made my childhood an exercise in systematic destruction? Why had I chosen mercy over revenge? "Because," I said slowly, "I'm not you." The words hung in the air between us, sharp as a blade. Eleanor flinched as if I'd slapped her, but she didn't look away. "No," she agreed quietly. "You're not me. You're better than me. You always were, and I couldn't stand it." Now it was my turn to flinch. "What? You were so much like I used to be, before life beat it out of me. Sensitive, creative, thoughtful. You felt everything so deeply, and I was terrified that the world would destroy that tenderness the way it had destroyed mine. So I tried to toughen you up, tried to prepare you for disappointment by disappointing you first." I stared at her, this skeletal woman who looked nothing like the formidable mother of my memories. "You tried to toughen me up by calling me worthless trash." Eleanor closed her eyes, tears streaming down her hollow cheeks. "I was trying to build armor around your heart. I thought if I criticized you before the world could, if I rejected you before others had the chance, maybe you'd develop the thick skin I'd never had. I thought I was protecting you." "You thought wrong," I said, and my voice was steady despite the earthquake happening inside my chest. "You didn't build armor around my heart, Eleanor. You built walls. For 23 years, I believed I was fundamentally unlovable, because the first woman who was supposed to love me couldn't find anything worth loving. I know." Her voice broke completely. "I know, and I've spent 15 years hating myself for it. Every day, I thought about calling you, about trying to explain, but I was so ashamed. I'd created the very thing I was trying to protect you from. I'd become the person who hurt you most. The apology I'd waited my entire life to hear was finally being offered, and it felt like receiving a gift I no longer wanted. Too little, too late, wrapped in justifications that made my childhood abuse sound like misguided love. "You want forgiveness," I said. It wasn't a question. "I want to earn it," Eleanor said, "if that's possible. If there's any way I can make amends for the damage I've done." I looked at this dying woman, this stranger who shared my DNA and had shaped my entire understanding of self-worth. Part of me wanted to give her the absolution she craved, to play the role of the gracious daughter who could forgive even the unforgivable. Another part of me wanted to walk out and never see her again, to let her die with the weight of her failures unresolved. But mostly, I just felt tired. "I need time," I said finally. "This doesn't fix anything, Eleanor. Your apologies don't erase 23 years of damage. They don't give me back the childhood you took from me, or the self-worth you destroyed. They're just words." "I know," she whispered, "but they're true words. I love you, Amelia. I have always loved you, even when I was too broken to show it properly. Love, the word I'd craved my entire childhood, finally offered when it was too late to heal the wounds created by its absence." I looked at Eleanor Chen, dying woman, terrible mother, complicated human being, and tried to find some feeling besides exhaustion. "I'll think about it," I said, and left before she could respond. Standing in the driveway of my childhood home, I realized that some stories don't have neat endings. Sometimes the villain apologizes, the hero shows mercy, and everyone involved is still broken. Sometimes grace isn't about feeling better. It's just about choosing to break cycles instead of perpetuating them. But there was still one more revelation to come, one final twist that would change everything I thought I knew about my family's story. I didn't go home after leaving Eleanor. Instead, I found myself at Sarah's house, a modest colonial in the suburbs that looked exactly like the kind of place where normal families lived normal lives. I'd never been there before, had never been invited to see the life my sister had built after our fractured childhood. Sarah answered the door in her pajamas, her face puffy from crying. "Amy, what are you doing here? I need to understand something," I said, "about our childhood, about why you were treated so differently." She stepped aside to let me in, and I was struck by how warm her house felt. Family photographs covered every surface. Sarah with a man I assumed was her husband, Sarah holding a baby, Sarah at various stages of happiness I'd never been witness to. This was what I'd imagined normal families looked like from the outside. "Coffee?" she offered, but I shook my head. "Just truth," I said. "I need you to tell me everything you remember about our childhood. Not the sanitized version, not what you think I want to hear. Everything." Sarah settled into her couch, pulling her knees up to her chest like she was trying to make herself smaller. "Where do I start?" "Start with why they loved you and not me. What was the difference?" Sarah was quiet for so long I thought she wasn't going to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "They were afraid of you," she said. "Afraid of me? I was a child. What could they possibly be afraid of? Not afraid like you'd hurt them. Afraid of failing you, I guess. Amy, you were so smart, so intense, so aware of everything. You saw through people's bullshit, even as a little kid. You asked hard questions. You called them out when they were being hypocrites. You were more than they knew how to handle." I stared at my sister, trying to process what she was telling me. "So they decided to tear me down instead of rising to meet me." "I think so. Yeah. With me, they could be mediocre parents and I'd still adore them. I was easy to please, easy to manipulate, easy to control. But you," Sarah shook her head, "you would have demanded they be better people, and I don't think they were capable of that." The pieces were starting to form a picture I'd never considered. All these years, I'd believed I was fundamentally flawed, that something inherent in me made me unlovable. But what if the opposite was true? What if I'd been punished not for my failings, but for my strengths? "There's something else," Sarah said, and her voice was strange now, filled with something that might have been guilt or fear, something I should have told you years ago, but I was too ashamed. My stomach dropped. "What?" "The college fund." Sarah's words came out in a rush, like she was afraid she'd lose her nerve if she didn't say them quickly. "You know how they said there wasn't money for you to go to college? How you had to work 3 jobs and get scholarships to afford it?" I nodded. It had been one of the most painful revelations of my late teens, discovering that my parents had plenty of money for their own luxuries, but claimed poverty when it came to investing in my future. "There was money," Sarah said quietly. "There was a college fund for you. Grandma and Grandpa Chen had set it up when you were born, same as they did for me. $50,000, sitting in an account with your name on it." The words hit me like a physical blow. "What happened to it?" Sarah couldn't meet my eyes. "Mom and Dad spent it. When I was accepted to Princeton, when I needed money for tuition and living expenses, they took your fund and gave it to me. They said you'd never amount to anything anyway, that the money would be wasted on you." I stood up abruptly, my vision swimming. $50,000. The money that could have paid for college, that could have eliminated the crushing debt that had followed me for years, that could have given me options I'd never had. They'd stolen my future and given it to their golden child, then watched me struggle without ever acknowledging what they'd done. "You knew?" My voice came out as a whisper. "You knew they stole my college fund?" I found out later, when I was going through their financial papers to help with Mom's medical bills. I saw the statements, saw both accounts, saw what they'd done. Sarah was crying now, great heaving sobs that shook her entire body. "I offered to pay it back, to give you the money, but they said you were out of their lives and it was too late. They said bringing it up would just cause more pain. As if the pain of being rejected and abandoned by my own family wasn't enough. As if discovering they'd literally stolen my future to invest in my sister's wouldn't matter, because I was already gone." "How long have you known?" I asked. 3 years. Sarah's voice was muffled by her hands. 3 years of carrying this guilt, of knowing I'd benefited from their theft, of knowing I should contact you but not knowing how to explain something so horrible. 3 years. While I'd been working night shifts to pay off student loans, while I'd been living in that cramped apartment and eating ramen for dinner, my sister had been sitting on the knowledge that my parents had robbed me to pay for her privileged education. "I tried to give it back," Sarah said desperately. "When I found out, I tried to set up a fund to repay you, but they stopped me. They said it would destroy the family, that some secrets were better left buried." The family. The family that had already been destroyed the night they called me worthless trash, and I walked away forever. They'd been protecting a family that existed only in their imagination, while the daughter they'd robbed was building a new life from nothing. "That's not even the worst part," Sarah continued, and I couldn't imagine what could be worse than what she'd already revealed. What else? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. The money that paid for Mom's treatments. The anonymous donation that saved her life. Sarah looked up at me with eyes full of tears and shame. You gave them back more than they ever stole from you. You gave them $1 million to save the life of the woman who took your future away. The irony was so complete it was almost beautiful in its cruelty. I'd saved Eleanor Chen with money she'd never thought I'd be capable of earning, had showed them more generosity than they'd ever shown me, had proven their assessment of my worth wrong in the most dramatic way possible. But more than that, I'd proven something to myself. The little girl they'd convinced was worthless trash had grown into a woman who could choose mercy over revenge, who could break cycles instead of perpetuating them, who could be better than the people who'd raised her. I need to go, I said, standing on unsteady legs. Amy, please, Sarah started, but I held up my hand. I need to process this. All of it. The apology, the college fund, everything. I paused at her door, looking back at my sister, this woman who'd benefited from my parents' theft but hadn't orchestrated it, who'd carried guilt that wasn't entirely hers to bear. Sarah, I said quietly, I forgive you. You were a kid when they took my money, and you tried to make it right when you learned about it. That matters. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. What about them? What about Mom and Dad? I thought about Eleanor, dying in her living room, finally offering the apologies I'd waited decades to hear. I thought about Robert, crying on my phone, learning about grace through the grace I'd shown despite not owing it. I thought about forgiveness and mercy, about cycles and choices, about the difference between deserving something and receiving it anyway. I don't know, I said honestly, but I know I don't have to decide today. As I drove away from Sarah's house, I realized that the story I'd been telling myself for 15 years, the story of the worthless daughter rejected by parents who couldn't love her, had been wrong. I hadn't been rejected because I was flawed. I'd been rejected because I was threatening. I hadn't been unloved because I was unlovable. I'd been unloved because love would have required them to be better people than they were capable of being. The lottery win hadn't just changed my bank account. It had given me the power to rewrite the ending of my story. I could choose revenge or mercy, justice or grace, isolation or connection. For the first time in my life, all the power was mine. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. 3 months later, I established the Amelia Chen Foundation for Educational Opportunity, providing college scholarships for students from difficult family situations. The first recipient was a young woman whose parents had told her she'd never amount to anything. Eleanor died peacefully 6 months after our confrontation, with Sarah holding one hand and Robert holding the other. She'd asked for me in her final hours, but I wasn't ready yet. Maybe I never would be, and maybe that was okay. Robert calls sometimes now. We don't talk about forgiveness or redemption. We talk about small things, safe things, the weather and current events, and nothing that matters. It's not much, but it's something. It's a beginning. Sarah and I have lunch every few weeks. She's still paying back the money our parents stole from me, though I've told her repeatedly that it's not necessary. It is to me, she says, and I understand. Sometimes making amends isn't about what the wounded person needs. It's about what the person who caused the wound needs to do to live with themselves. As for me, I'm still figuring out what comes next. I left nursing. The lottery money gave me that freedom, but I haven't decided what to do with the rest of my life. For now, I'm learning how to exist without the armor I've worn for 38 years, learning how to accept love without suspicion, learning how to trust that I deserve happiness. The girl they called worthless trash grew up to be worth more than they ever imagined, not because of the lottery money, but because she chose to become someone better than the people who raised her. And in the end, maybe that's the only victory that matters.